You know that sci-fi movie, Minority Report?
Okay, Jed, what's coming?
It's where cops arrest people before they even commit the crimes.
There hasn't been a murder in 6 years.
Good movie, but by the end you're thinking, man, I hope that never happens.
We are arresting individuals who've broken the law.
Well, this weekend we got pretty close in Portland.
Get back! Get out of the street!
A day of rage that took down 2 ex-presidents earns backlash from both Portland's mayoral candidates. But why did rioters target Abe Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt? And how did the holiday formerly known as Columbus Day become the holiday currently known as Indigenous Peoples Day? Here's the story. And I'm Dan Haggerty. Hi, welcome to The Story. I have a feeling you might have the urge to talk to us tonight. Call it a hunch. We're here to listen. You're all pent up after the weekend, right? It's Monday. We got to get things going here. Comment on my Facebook page at Dan Haggerty KGW. Email us at thestory@kgw.com or use Twitter and the hashtag HeyDan. Now, I think the most obvious place to start is going to be with our ongoing segment. Were there clashes between police and protesters last night? Oh, yeah. Yep. Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too technical with my journalism terms here, but some would say last night was kind of nuts. I mean, the whole weekend was kind of nuts, if you want to be totally honest. And I know this is top of mind. Last night's Day of Rage ahead of the Indigenous Peoples Day, the holiday formerly known as Columbus Day. Hundreds of protesters swept the park blocks in downtown Portland and tore down the statues of Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, both nearly 100 years old. We're going to talk a lot about that in just a couple seconds, I promise. But this is what I want to talk about first. The protest a day earlier, on Saturday night in North Portland. Portland police say about 75 people came to demonstrate their North Precinct on North Killingsworth. No one tore down any statues there, or threw a rock, or broke a window, or lit a fire, nothing. But as soon as they stepped out onto MLK Boulevard, police warned them to get back on the sidewalk. And when they didn't, this happened.
Get back! Get out of the street, every one of you! You get arrested too.
All right, police say they made 26 targeted arrests, but according to some of the independent journalists there on the ground, and really what you can see from this video if you watch it from beginning to end, they say police were pretty much just arresting anybody that they could. Now, of course, we've seen Portland police use much stronger tactics before than that. We've seen them use tear gas and rubber bullets, but we rarely see them swoop in and arrest an entire group like that for something as relatively minor as walking in the street. But PPB says they had a good reason. They say things looked like they could get out of control. In their press release the next morning, they said they had information the protest would be a so-called direct action event. Also, they cited the group's posture and their attire. Many were in black and wearing body armor. And, quote, due to these concerns and the fact there were resources in place to make arrests, action was taken earlier in this event than ones before. Basically, police suspected things were going to get ugly, so they stepped in and they stopped it before it happened. Now, if police predicting crime and taking action before one is actually committed sounds familiar, it's probably because you remember this.
I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks. Give the man his hat.
The future can be seen. Minority Report.
The future. Now, for those of you who haven't seen Minority Report, good flick. It's about police who are able to look into the future to see people committing crimes before they actually happen. They arrest people before anybody gets hurt. Everything works out in the end. Just kidding. Spoiler alert, for an 18-year-old movie, it turns out police have been sending innocent people to jail for years. I know, that movie's 18 years old. Tom Cruise isn't getting older and no one's talking about it. I don't know. That's for another day. That said, we do need to stress the danger of police becoming more aggressive based solely on what people look like and how they dress. Stop it. I can already hear you. I can hear you screaming from here. But Dan, we've seen enough over 120 plus days of protests and riots to know what was coming next. People showing up in helmets and body armor. Don't be naive. Police aren't stupid, and they stopped the violence before it got started. And while that argument will certainly hold up over Thanksgiving dinner, the specifics of our justice system, the ways our laws are written, aren't as easily hashed out. Now, there are a few cases where police can arrest someone before a crime actually happens, like attempted murder, maybe supporting terrorists with resources to do terrible things, or conspiracy to commit a crime, like setting a bank robbery in motion. But Lewis and Clark law professor Tung Yin says what happened Saturday doesn't sound like it qualifies.
It doesn't fit any of the terrorism type of crimes. And it's not really, there's no attempt of murder or anything. So, what exactly is the charge that the police are filing, and what is the equivalent prosecution charge that could be brought? Because otherwise, if all they're saying is, well, we look at a bunch of these people and they look like they're dressed in military gear, they look dangerous, so we arrested them just to be safe. That sounds like they're just arresting people because they look dangerous.
Now, technically, they arrested them for interfering with police when they tried to get that group to leave the street and get back on the sidewalk, which is a crime. Now, it's a crime the DA says he's not going to prosecute in these circumstances, but it's still a crime. But using more aggressive tactics, using that rationale, could start to get dangerous for everyone's rights. And I know that is a hard stance to take, especially when the very next day, people dressed the exact same way commit blatant acts of destruction, like, say, topping the statues of former presidents in downtown Portland. And that brings us to our big story. See, I told you we were going to talk about those statues coming down. Last night's day of rage has led to a day of outrage from a lot of people, from Mayor Wheeler to his challenger, Sarah Iannarone, to historians, even some activists weighing in on this. And by now, you probably know the statues of President Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt were torn down last night by protesters. A group also broke windows of the Oregon Historical Society and threw flares inside. Now, lately, it's pretty hard to get Mayor Wheeler and his challenger, Sarah Iannarone, to agree on anything, but they did seem to agree last night was unacceptable. That brings us to our quote of the day. It's kind of a double header. We're going to hear from both of them. First, from Mayor Wheeler, who said this morning that, quote, these acts are obscene. And second, from his challenger, Sarah Iannarone, who agreed, saying, quote, we are not going to be governed by shooting paintballs. Maggie Vespa takes it from here.
A crowd gathered around a crane in downtown Portland today, waiting to see if crews will lift another toppled statue, this one of Theodore Roosevelt. Down the street, crowds also tore down one of Abraham Lincoln. Video shows some of, police estimate, 300 plus smashing windows at the Oregon Historical Society. Part of a march through the city Sunday night called the Day of Rage, a demonstration that supposedly was aimed at supporting indigenous people oppressed for centuries. Museum directors say people threw flares inside. Thankfully, they burned themselves out. But the carpeting is scorched. The crowd also stole a quilt from the lobby made by black women for the bicentennial. It's back, wet, bleeding, and torn.
The people who did this don't understand how we have worked to tell the true story of Oregon, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
I fired 2 rounds, one through this window, one through this window.
Blocks away, the owner of Heroes American Cafe says bullets and he thinks a baseball bat came through his window. John Jackson is himself a veteran. His restaurant pays tribute to first responders, and he thinks protesters, angry at police, took notice.
Whoever they were definitely agitators, because their peaceful protests would not have taken the turn that we've taken last night. There's no reason to damage property.
The damage and the chaos Sunday night blasted by local officials this morning, including State Representative Tana Sanchez.
We as Indigenous people stand with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's what this moment is about. The fact that someone would hijack Indigenous Peoples Day to cause more violence is not appropriate.
Here's Portland's Mayor Ted Wheeler.
I know that last night, after people engaged in their acts of criminal destruction and violence, they were bragging about it on social media. They are not engaged in any activity that has any relationship whatsoever to racial justice or equity. They are purely engaged in violence and criminal destruction for the sake of violence and criminal destruction.
The chief of police said a total of 3 people were arrested Sunday night. They're still investigating a lot of what happened. But that in and of itself is a topic of discussion on social media as well. Critics pointing out police arrested close to 30 people at a protest Saturday night. Police saying in a press release they moved in preemptively because they'd gotten tips things were going to get violent. Now, there was another demonstration on Sunday of, quote, militia members, aka armed men marching through Portland with semi-automatic rifles and, according to videos on social media, confronting people in downtown. Police in that case didn't arrest anyone. Now, the chief said that Portland police handled each demonstration as they did based on a number of factors, including safety and available resources. The mayor now is calling on everyone in the community to denounce violence. Meanwhile, cleanup continues today. Museum directors say repairs will cost upwards of $25,000. That said, there are a few bright spots. Restoration has started on that quilt, and staff are hopeful. There was also this note left by a homeless man named Oscar. He wrote he had seen the damage and donated what he could to help. Maggie Vespa, KGW News.
How about that? You might be wondering why these statues, okay? Why Lincoln? Why Teddy? I mean, we've seen the Confederate statues being torn down across the country, and the root of that has been pretty obvious in all the discussions we're having. It's about slavery and the Civil War. But why take down the statue of the president who ended slavery? Well, Kristen Severance explains Lincoln means something else entirely to the indigenous communities.
Columbus Day is a legal holiday commemorating the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the Americas in 1492. It's celebrated by some states on the second Monday of October. Other states, including Oregon, since 2017, now commemorate the day as Indigenous Peoples Day, a day to recognize the mistreatment of Native populations after the arrival of Columbus. Protesters called Sunday the, quote, Indigenous Peoples Day of Rage. 200 people marched downtown. Some destroyed statues in Portland, including the Theodore Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln statues in the South Park blocks, both in Portland since the 1920s. The Lincoln statue had Dakota 38 spray painted on its base, referencing the 38 Dakota men executed in 1862. According to historians, Lincoln approved the hanging of 38 Dakota men after a violent conflict with white settlers in Minnesota. He later commuted the sentences of 265 others. According to historians, Roosevelt said hostile and derogatory things about Native Americans, including, quote, I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are. And he pushed policies including the allotment system, where Native American land was allotted to those who became U.S. citizens first and white settlers second. Portland State University professor Mark Rodriguez said many people don't know about Lincoln or Roosevelt's history with indigenous people.
You know, the presidents reflected the times in which they were serving as president of the United States. And so, for example, Lincoln is credited with freeing the slaves, but he wasn't particularly someone that had a very enlightened view of the capacity of African Americans. Today, we might think that some of his views about Native Americans and African Americans were racist. We would also say the same thing about Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt was a progressive. He did a lot of things when it came to government reform, but at the same time, he believed in what we would today probably refer to as white supremacy. And this was pretty common among educated people in the late 19th century and early 20th century, this belief which was referred to as eugenics, basically that white people were the perfect example of humans and everybody else was less than.
Now, as a historian, Professor Rodriguez says it's a good thing that people are learning about the complicated history of our past. He did tell me, though, that historians are really split on if certain statues should stay or go. Do you have something you want us to look into? Do you have a question? We will do the research. Just let us know. Reach out using the hashtag HeyDan.
Kristen, thank you. Look, it's not just historians split on this stuff. I mean, we were talking about the Thanksgiving dinner table earlier. It gets split pretty much everywhere. And no matter how you feel about what these rioters did last night, and again, I've heard the argument that tearing down these statues creates a conversation about this country's history, and that if we can face the flaws of our most revered figures, then we can truly accept them and face them ourselves. But even for the most hardcore defenders of protest, the vandalism at the Oregon Historical Society was a step too far. And this email might give us some insight into why. A viewer named Herb McDonald emailed us today saying, I'm not sure the protesters have any idea what they did last night in the destruction of the Oregon Historical Society building, and in particular, the quilt. What is the quilt, you might be asking? Maggie had a bit on it just a moment ago. This is the quilt, the Afro-American Heritage Bicentennial Commemorative Quilt. It just went on display at the beginning of the month. It was created in 1974 by a group of 15 black women to honor the heritage and contributions of black Americans through the country's history. This morning, it was found outside, on the ground, soaking wet. Here is something we think is worth your time. Late last month, OPB's Think Out Loud talked to the last surviving member of that group of 15 women, Sylvia Gates Carlisle. Her mom was the one who spearheaded the entire project, and here's what she had to say about her mother.
My mother was raised that legacy was important. And so these were her friends. These were ladies I knew. And I was thinking that I was a small contributor to making sure that their legacy wasn't forgotten.
You can hear the rest of the conversation at opb.org. We think it's worth your time because it is. Now, for decades, today meant honoring Christopher Columbus. Not anymore. So how did we get here? And before we called today Indigenous Peoples Day, we had the Columbus Day storm of 1962. And we've had a viewer who's been asking for months for us to find the video in the Kgw Vault. Well, I hope you don't mind. We waited this long to dig it out, but you only have to wait a few more minutes longer to see it yourself when the story continues. Welcome back to the story. Hey, remember, chat with us during the show. You can ask us a question on Facebook. You can email us at thestory@kgw.com or pick up your phone, hop on Twitter and use that hashtag HeyDan. Viewer Christine went the Facebook route when she asked us a question about registering to vote. She asked, I haven't transferred my Texas driver's license to Oregon. Can I still vote in Oregon? Yes, of course, you definitely can. It just takes a couple of extra steps. As you know, if you're new to town, or you probably know in general, when you get your driver's license, you automatically get registered to vote. But you can register otherwise by doing so online through the Secretary of State's office. When they ask you for your Oregon DMV number, you won't have one, so you just check the box that says you don't have one. You can use some other numbers like a social security number and stuff to fill that out. Now, after you fill out the rest of your info, you're going to get a PDF of a voter registration card, and you're going to need to print that out, sign it, and send it to your local county elections office, which will complete your registration. But keep this in mind. Remember, you have until tomorrow to register in Oregon. The deadline is October 13th. So at this point, if you're taking all those steps and you're going through all that and printing stuff out and signing it, it's best to just hop in the car, drive it down to the local elections office in whatever county you're in, and drop that off ASAP. Make sure you're registered. Now, in the first part of the show, you heard from somebody named Sanchez. She's an Oregon State representative and only the second Native American to serve in the state's legislature, only the first representing Portland. She had a lot more thoughts about last night's Indigenous Peoples Day of Rage and the destruction at the Oregon Historical Society.
The Indigenous people in my community are very clear about the fact that this is about Black Lives Matter right now. It's not about us. And we shouldn't be taking over the stage. That's just the reality of it. And the destruction of, in particular, the Oregon Historical Society it's not functional. That is the place that actually holds the truth. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not and deal with it is another issue, but it actually holds the truth. And the Oregon Historical Society has done an amazing job at really stepping it up lately and talking about the truth and owning that and helping people in Oregon understand what's been happening. It's a really important place, and its destruction is just unconscionable.
Of course, you know, there is a huge Native American community in this region, 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon alone. But even that really doesn't paint the whole picture, because Sanchez says 360 different tribes call the Portland area alone home. She says there's anywhere between 45 and 60,000 Native people living in the metro area today. That's the 9th largest urban Native American population in the country. We asked Sanchez why it's so important to this community to celebrate today as Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day.
I think it should have been from the very beginning people recognizing you can't discover a place that's already inhabited. And just because you didn't understand our language or our way of documenting things didn't mean that we weren't real.
On that note, let's take a little dive into the history of this holiday.
How you feeling out there?
So it's Indigenous Peoples Day, or is it Columbus Day? Actually, it depends on who you ask. So how did we get here? We can start with the song. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And then, for hundreds of years after, we celebrated that historic voyage to the so-called New World. Just not in Oregon. We actually don't recognize it as an official holiday here. In fact, since 1992, Native American groups have been pushing states to do the same, to remove Columbus Day and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, critics slam this idea. They think it is overly PC. But supporters, many of them Indigenous Americans, don't feel like celebrating a man whose arrival opened the door to the slaughter, enslavement, and torture of their ancestors, while stealing their land, of course. So in 2015, Portland leaders officially declared the second Monday in October Indigenous Peoples Day. Seattle and Minneapolis did the same. And that's how we got here. Now, one of our favorite segments here on The Story is going into the Kgw Vault. We dig around in our archives. We look for old video from the past. And you know how crazy local news is. When it rains or it snows, we go crazy for that sort of thing. So just imagine how much old weather video we have down there. It's a ton. So when a viewer named Steve emailed about a storm from 58 years ago today, we knew we had to check it out. Steve said October 1962 had the Columbus Day storm. KGW weatherman Jack Capel's description of the storm arriving is great. Weather tracking was different in '62. I was 5½, and it was my earliest visual memory. That's really cool, Steve. He actually emailed us months ago, so Steve, sorry to keep you waiting so long. But for anybody who thinks, man, we haven't responded to you, so we keep some of these emails around for a long time. I hope you don't mind that we kept it for this actual holiday. As for everybody else alive at the time, I'm sure the storm is hard to forget. It was one of the most powerful storms of the century in the U.S. It killed 46 people. And here's what we dug up in the Kgw Vault.
The force of the storm was recorded on wind gauges around the state. At Corvallis, winds gusted up to 127 miles per hour. On the Morrison Street Bridge, the wind gauge there registered gusts up to 116. The wind literally tore off rooftops. It subsided during the night, but left behind tangled wires, shattered windows, downed trees, and left thousands of homes without phone service or electric power. People lined up to buy dry ice to preserve their frozen food. Camp stoves were at a premium. Much of the loss was insured, and the cost of repairs forced many insurance companies on the brink of bankruptcy. Those not covered by insurance merely bore the loss. The forest industry was hard hit. The wind knocked down $250 million worth of prime Douglas fir. Wind also knocked down our television tower. Channel 8 was off the air for a week until a new temporary tower was erected to replace the old one.
How about that voice? That's a newsman. Could you imagine having no access to any news for like a week, at least from KGW? I couldn't. Hey, thank you so much for sending that idea in. We love getting ideas from the vault. Keep sending them in. You can do that in a lot of different ways. Email us at thestory@kgw.com. You can find me on Facebook. Use that hashtag HeyDan on Twitter. In fact, do that right now. Leave a comment, ask a question. We're going to read a few when we finish the story. Next. All right, I think we got another fan of the vault, Kenneth. Using the hashtag HeyDan on Twitter, he said, I moved here 10 plus years ago. That was the first video I've seen of the 1962 storm. Thank you. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I tell you, we can go down there and dig around all of the time, but a lot of big fans of the vault. As far as the other things that people were writing in had to do with the top part of the show. We talk about protesters, people tearing down statues, and the response from police. There's a lot to go through. There were a few things that I wanted to kind of have an impulse reaction to right here on the air, but instead I'm going to think about it and get back to you. So there's a lot more left to this week to have our discussion, so let's keep them coming. Use that hashtag HeyDan. Don't do Hey Dawn. That's not me. I'm Hey Dan. I'll see you tomorrow.